Hold on to your wimples, because medieval women were way more than just damsels waiting for a knight or quiet nuns in a convent. Some women actually ran their own international shipping businesses. Imagine that. And it wasn't just a fluke. In bustling cities like Paris, certain fancy trades, like making silk purses, were almost entirely run by women. Forget the fairy tales. Some medieval women were blacksmiths pounding hot iron, while others were master brewers, their ales the talk of the town. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for hilariously rowdy ones. Number 7. The alewife pouring more than just pints. Picture this. A medieval town, dusty streets, and the cheerful sign of an ale stake. A pole with a leafy branch, or a painted sign sticking out from a house. This was your medieval Yelp review, signaling that fresh ale was ready. And who was often behind this bubbling, frothy enterprise? The alewife. Brewing ale was a super common way for women to earn money, often starting right in their own kitchens. It was a skill many women learned, like baking bread. The ingredients were relatively simple: water, malted barley, or other grains like oats or wheat, yeast, and sometimes flavorings like groot, a mix of herbs like bog, myrtle, or yarrow before hops became widespread. The process itself was hard work. First, the grain had to be malted, soaked, allowed to sprout, then dried and lightly roasted in a kiln. This created the sugars needed for fermentation. Then, the malt was ground, mixed with hot water in a mashing tun to extract those sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. This wort was then boiled, often with the groot, cooled, and then the magic ingredient, yeast, was added. Fermentation would take a few days in large vats or barrels. Ale in the Middle Ages didn't keep very long, usually just a few days to a week, because it wasn't typically hopped like modern beer. Hops act as a preservative. This meant brewing was a frequent, almost continuous task if an alewife wanted a steady income. Many alewives sold their brew directly from their homes. Some might have a dedicated room or just serve customers in their main living space. It wasn't uncommon for these alehouses to become social hubs, places where locals gathered to chat, play games, and of course, drink. This also meant the alewife was often an innkeeper of sorts, providing a lively atmosphere. However, this could also lead to trouble. Alehouses were sometimes seen as noisy, disorderly places, and alewives themselves were occasionally stereotyped in popular culture as being a bit gossipy or even dishonest, perhaps watering down their ale or overcharging. Chaucer's wife of Bath, for instance, mentions she was a brewer in her youth. The quality of ale was a big deal. Towns often had ale conners or ale tasters, officials whose job it was to check the quality and price of ale. If an alewife's brew wasn't up to scratch, or if she was caught using false measures, she could be fined or even put in the stocks or pillory. Despite these regulations, brewing was a vital part of the medieval economy and a significant source of income for many women. Some were so successful they ran substantial operations. For a widow, taking over her husband's brewing equipment and business was a common way to support herself and her family. While men also brewed, especially on a larger commercial scale or in monasteries, domestic brewing and small-scale selling was very much a woman's domain in many parts of medieval Europe. The clinking of mugs and the smell of fermenting grain were everyday parts of life, thanks in large part to these hard-working women. They weren't just making a beverage. They were fermenting community and commerce, one batch at a time. Number 6. The spinner and weaver. Threads of survival. Imagine a world without factories, where every single thread of every piece of fabric, from the roughest peasant smock to the finest lordly tapestry, had to be made by hand. This was the medieval world, and the backbone of this colossal textile industry was overwhelmingly women. Spinning and weaving were not just occupations. They were near universal skills for women, essential for clothing their families and, for many, a crucial way to earn a living. Let's start with spinning. This was the most time-consuming part of cloth production. The raw material, wool from sheep, flax for linen, or sometimes hemp, had to be cleaned and carded. For wool, using hand cards with wire teeth to align the fibers, or heckled. For flax, drawing it through combs to separate the long fibers. Then came the spinning itself. For centuries, the main tool was the drop spindle, a weighted stick. The spinner would draw out fibers from a bundle, often held on a distaff, a separate stick tucked into her belt or held under her arm. Twist them together by rotating the spindle and let it drop towards the ground, its weight and spin forming the yarn. As the spindle neared the floor, she'd stop it, wind the newly made yarn onto it, and start the process again. It was slow, repetitive work, often done while walking, watching children, or socializing. The spinning wheel, which sped up the process, began to appear in Europe from the 13th century, but spread slowly, and the drop spindle remained common for a long time, especially for certain types of yarn or in rural areas. It was said that it took 10 spinners to keep one weaver busy. Once the yarn was spun, it was ready for the weaver. Weaving was done on a loom. The simplest was the warp-weighted loom, an ancient design where the vertical warp threads were held taut by weights at the bottom. Later, the horizontal treadle loom became more common, especially for wider cloths. This was a more complex machine where the weaver used foot pedals treadles to lift different sets of warp threads, creating a shed through which the weft thread, carried on a shuttle, could be passed. Weaving required strength, coordination, and a good understanding of patterns. While men often operated the larger, more commercial looms, especially in organized urban workshops or guilds, women wove too, particularly narrower cloths or in domestic settings. They might weave for their family's needs or produce cloth to sell at the local market. The textile trade was huge. Wool from England, for example, was prized across Europe, and towns in Flanders, modern-day Belgium and Netherlands, became incredibly wealthy processing it into fine cloth. Women were involved in almost every stage, sorting wool, washing it, carding, combing, spinning, sometimes dyeing, and even finishing the cloth, though fulling, a process of pounding and cleaning the cloth to felt it, was heavy work often done by men at fulling mills. In some towns, women formed their own guilds or were admitted to guilds alongside men, particularly in trades like silk weaving or embroidery, which were considered highly skilled. However, even without formal guild membership, women's labor was indispensable. They often worked on a piece rate basis, paid for the amount of yarn spun or cloth woven. This pay was almost always less than what men earned for comparable skilled work. Yet for many medieval women, especially widows, single women, or those whose husbands had low or irregular incomes, spinning and weaving were lifelines, the threads that held their households together. their fingers constantly moving, wove not just fabric, but the very fabric of medieval society. Number 5. The baker, daily bread, and fiery ovens. The smell of baking bread is a comforting one, and in the Middle Ages, it was the smell of life itself. Bread was the absolute staple of the medieval diet for almost everyone, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble. And while some households, especially in the countryside, might have baked their own bread if they had access to an oven, which wasn't always the case, as ovens were fire risks and expensive to build, many people, particularly in towns and cities, relied on professional bakers. Among these bakers were many women. Baking was a demanding job. It started very early in the morning, often before dawn, to ensure fresh bread was available for customers. The first task was to get the oven fired up. Medieval ovens were typically large dome-shaped structures made of brick or stone. They were heated by burning wood or bundles of faggots directly inside them. Once the oven reached the right temperature, judged by experience, perhaps by how quickly a handful of flour browned when thrown in the embers and ash were raked out. Then the dough, which had been prepared earlier, was loaded in. Making the dough was a laborious process. Flour, which could be wheat, rye, barley, or a mix depending on the region and the price, was mixed with water, yeast, often a piece of leftover dough from the previous day, called leaven or barm from brewing, and salt. This was kneaded by hand in large troughs, a physically strenuous task requiring strong arms and stamina. Different types of bread were made. Fine white wheaten bread, manchet, for the wealthy, coarser brown or black breads made from rye or barley for the poor, and various specialty loaves. Bakers might also make pies, pastries, and cakes, though bread was their main business. Women bakers often ran small-scale operations, perhaps from their own homes if they had an oven. They might sell their bread directly from a window or stall, or hawk it through the streets. In some cases, a woman might inherit a bakery business from her husband or father. Guilds of bakers existed in many towns, and these organizations regulated the trade, setting standards for quality, weight, and price of loaves. The assize of bread was a common law that fixed the price of bread relative to the price of grain. Bakers who sold underweight loaves or poor quality bread faced hefty fines, public shaming like being dragged through the streets on a hurdle, with the offending loaf tied around their neck, or even having their ovens destroyed. While men dominated the official guild structures in many places, women were certainly active as bakers. Sometimes they were recognized guild members. Other times, they operated more informally or as part of a family business where the husband might be the registered guild member, but the wife did much of the actual baking and selling. For a woman, especially a widow, baking offered a way to make an independent living. It required skill, strength, and business sense. The bakery, with its warmth and the constant aroma of baking, would have been a familiar and vital part of any medieval town. The women who toiled there, covered in flour and facing the heat of the oven, were providing the most fundamental of necessities, ensuring that their communities had their daily bread. They were not just baking. They were sustaining life. Number 4, the midwife and healer, hands of comfort and care. In an age before modern medicine, before hospitals as we know them, and when university-trained physicians, almost exclusively men, were rare and expensive, The first and often only port of call for most people when they were sick or injured, and certainly for women in childbirth, was a local healer or midwife. These roles were predominantly filled by women who relied on a combination of traditional knowledge passed down through generations, practical experience, and an understanding of herbal remedies. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a dangerous time for both mother and baby. Midwives were the undisputed experts in managing it. They were usually older women, often mothers themselves, who had gained a reputation for skill and calm in the birthing room. A midwife's role began before labor, offering advice to the expectant mother. When labor started, she would be summoned to the woman's home. Birthing typically took place in a warm room, often with other female relatives and friends present, creating a supportive, women-centered environment. The midwife would offer comfort, encouragement, and practical assistance. She knew how to check the baby's position, how to help turn a baby in a difficult presentation, though this was incredibly risky, and when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. She might use herbal preparations to ease pain or speed up labor, and she would have basic tools, though these were simple. After the birth, the midwife would cut the umbilical cord, check the baby for any immediate problems, and help the mother deliver the placenta. She would also perform the initial washing and swaddling of the newborn. Importantly, in a deeply religious society, if a baby was born very weak and seemed unlikely to survive, the midwife was often authorized to perform an emergency baptism. This was considered crucial for the salvation of the baby's soul. For her services, a midwife would typically be paid a fee or receive gifts of food or drink. Experienced and respected midwives were highly valued members of their communities. They weren't just delivering babies. They were safeguarding the continuation of families and communities. Beyond childbirth, women healers played a broader role in everyday healthcare. They cultivated herb gardens, collecting plants known for their medicinal properties: lavender for calming, comfrey for wounds, chamomile for soothing, and many, many others. They knew how to prepare these herbs as infusions, poultices, salves, or syrups. They would be consulted for all sorts of common ailments: fevers, coughs, digestive troubles, skin conditions, and minor injuries. Their knowledge was practical and empirical, based on what had been observed to work. They might also offer advice on diet and hygiene. While university-trained physicians focused on theories of humors and complex and often ineffective treatments, these women healers provided accessible, affordable, and often genuinely helpful care. However, their position could be precarious. While many were respected, some women healers, particularly those who were very successful or unorthodox, could attract suspicion. In a society that sometimes feared witchcraft, a woman with deep knowledge of herbs and healing, especially if she lived alone or was considered eccentric, might find herself accused if a patient died or if misfortune struck the community. Despite these risks, women healers and midwives were indispensable. They were the guardians of health and new life, their hands bringing comfort and their knowledge offering relief in a world where suffering was common. Their work was a testament to female wisdom and resilience. Number 3. The merchant and tradeswoman, wheeling and dealing in a man's world. Sort of. When we think of medieval merchants, we might picture wealthy men in fur-trimmed robes, members of powerful guilds, trading exotic goods across continents. And while that was certainly part of the picture, it wasn't the whole story. Women too were active participants in the bustling world of medieval commerce, operating at various levels from humble street vendors to managers of substantial businesses. Many women worked as hucksters or peddlers, selling everyday goods in local markets or door to door. They might sell foodstuffs like eggs, cheese, butter, poultry, fruit, and vegetables, often produced by themselves or their families. Others sold small manufactured items like pins, ribbons, pottery, or simple household goods. These women were a vital part of the local economy, connecting producers with consumers. They needed to be shrewd negotiators, able to manage their small stock and turn a profit. Marketplaces were lively, noisy places, and these tradeswomen were right in the thick of it, calling out their wares, bargaining with customers, and keeping an eye on their goods. In towns and cities, women could also be shopkeepers. They might run shops selling bread if they were also bakers, ale as alewives, candles, textiles, or other necessities. Often, a woman would work alongside her husband in a family business. If her husband died, it was common for the widow to take over the running of the shop or workshop. Medieval guild regulations in many towns allowed a widow to continue her deceased husband's trade, sometimes for a limited period, sometimes for life, as long as she remained unmarried or hired a qualified journeyman. This provided a crucial means of support for many women and their children. Some of these widows became very successful businesswomen in their own right, managing apprentices, dealing with suppliers, and keeping their own accounts. Women were also involved in more specialized trades. In the textile industry, for instance, women could be involved in selling yarn or finished cloth. Some were silk workers, a highly skilled and often lucrative trade, particularly in cities like Paris or Venice. Records show women acting as moneylenders, though this was often a controversial activity. In some port cities, there are even instances of women owning shares in ships or financing trading voyages. While not the norm, it shows that Ottempel women could find opportunities. Of course, women merchants faced limitations. They generally couldn't access the same levels of capital or credit as men. Their participation in the most powerful merchant guilds was often restricted, though some guilds, particularly those for trades dominated by women, like certain branches of silk production or embroidery, were run by and for women. Legal restrictions could also be a factor. In some places, a married woman's property and earnings were legally under her husband's control. Despite these hurdles, many medieval women carved out a niche for themselves in the world of trade. They were resourceful, adaptable, and essential to the flow of goods and money that kept medieval society functioning. From the woman selling apples at a market stall to the widow managing a thriving workshop, they were all part of the vibrant tapestry of medieval commerce, their voices and activities adding to the hum of economic life. They weren't just minding the shop, they were making deals and making a living. Number 2. The artisan, cracking beauty and utility with skillful hands. Beyond the more common roles, medieval women could also be found in a surprising variety of skilled crafts, working as artisans who transformed raw materials into finished goods, sometimes of great beauty and utility. While men often dominated the officially recognized guilds for many crafts, women's contributions were significant, whether working independently, within family workshops, or even in some cases as recognized mistresses of their craft. One area where women artisans excelled was in luxury textile arts. Sokomen, for example, were highly skilled workers who handled the delicate and expensive silk threads to produce luxurious fabrics, ribbons, veils, and other adornments. This was particularly prominent in cities like Paris, where guilds of silkwomen existed, regulating the craft and training apprentices. Embroidery was another field where women's artistry shone. They created intricate designs on clothing, ecclesiastical vestments, banners, and tapestries, using colored silks, gold and silver threads, and even seed pearls. The quality of this work could be astonishing, and such items were highly prized by the wealthy and the church. Opus Anglicanum, or English work, was a type of elaborate embroidery famous across Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, much of it produced by women. Women were also involved in making clothing and accessories. While tailoring of men's complex garments was often a male-dominated guild, women sewed simpler garments, mended clothes, and made items like caps, purses, and girdles, belts. Girdle makers, for instance, could be women, crafting belts from leather or fabric, often embellished with metal buckles and ornaments. Candle making was another trade where women were active. Candles were essential for lighting, made either from tallow, animal fat, or for a cleaner, more expensive light from beeswax. The process involved repeatedly dipping wicks into molten wax or pouring wax into molds. In some areas, women even participated in metalworking trades, though this was less common and often faced more resistance from male-dominated guilds. There are records of women, blacksmiths, pewterers, or cutlers, often widows carrying on a family business. They would have needed considerable physical strength and skill to work with forges, hammers, and molten metal. Illuminators and scribes, who painstakingly copied and decorated manuscripts before the advent of printing, also included women, particularly within convents, but sometimes as lay professionals too. Christine de Pizan, a famous late medieval writer, supported herself and her family through her writing and by overseeing a scriptorium that employed scribes and illuminators, some of whom were women. Gaining entry into these skilled trades usually involved a period of apprenticeship, typically lasting several years. A young girl would be sent to live with a master or mistress of the craft to learn the skills and secrets of the trade. The terms of apprenticeship would be set out in a formal contract. Upon completion, she might work as a journeyman or journeywoman for wages, hoping eventually to become a mistress craftswoman and set up her own workshop, though this path was often more challenging for women than for men. Guilds played a complex role. Some explicitly excluded women, while others admitted them, sometimes only as widows of masters, but occasionally in their own right. In trades where women predominated, like some branches of silkwork or spinning, they might form their own guilds. These guilds set standards, regulated prices and wages, and provided a social and economic network for their members. The work of these women artisans, whether crafting a fine silk purse, a sturdy candle, an embroidered cloak, or even a well-shod horseshoe, added to the richness and functionality of medieval life. Their skilled hands shaped not just objects, but also their own livelihoods. Number 1. The agricultural worker, toiling the land from dawn till dusk. For the vast, overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages, life was rural, and work meant agriculture. And in this world of fields, farms, and livestock, women were not delicate bystanders. They were essential, hard-working, agricultural laborers, their efforts absolutely crucial to survival and the entire medieval economy, which was fundamentally based on what the land could produce. This wasn't a specialized occupation one chose. For most peasant women, it was simply life. A peasant woman's workday was long and incredibly varied, dictated by the seasons and the endless demands of the farm. She worked alongside her husband and other family members on their own small plot of land, if they were lucky enough to have one, and also performed labor service on the lord of the manor's domain, his private land, if they were serfs bound to the land. In spring, she would be involved in plowing, guiding the plow if not strong enough to push it, or managing the oxen, sowing seeds for crops like wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas, and beans. She would help with the endless task of weeding throughout the growing season, often by hand or with a simple hoe, a back-breaking job under the sun. Haymaking in early summer was a communal effort. Women raked the cut grass, turned it to dry, and helped to build the haystacks. Then came the harvest, the most critical time of the year. Everyone who could work, young and old, male and female, was out in the fields. Women reaped grain with sickles, scythes were heavier and more often used by men, bundled the sheaves, and helped to load them onto carts. Gleaning, collecting any leftover ears of grain after the main harvest was done, was a rite often reserved for women and children, and it could make the difference between having enough food for winter or going hungry. After the grain harvest came the fruit harvest from orchards, apples, pears, plums, which women would gather and then process by drying or making into cider or perry. They also tended vegetable gardens close to their cottages, growing vital additions to the family diet like cabbages, onions, carrots, and herbs. Beyond the fields, women were typically responsible for tending to the smaller livestock. This included poultry, chickens for eggs and meat, geese and ducks. They milked cows or goats and then processed the milk into butter and cheese, vital sources of protein and fat, and also valuable items to sell or trade at the local market. Caring for pigs, which often foraged in nearby woods, was another common task. Women also collected firewood from forests or common lands, a constant necessity for cooking and heating. They fetched water from the local well or stream, often carrying heavy buckets. Inside the cottage their work continued, grinding grain by hand with a quern, a small hand mill, if they couldn't afford to use the Lord's mill, baking bread if they had access to an oven, or using a communal one, brewing ale for family consumption, mending clothes, and of course caring for children. The life of a female agricultural worker was one of unceasing physical labor. There were few tools to ease the burden: a sickle, a hoe, a rake. Their hands were calloused, their backs ached, and they were exposed to all kinds of weather. Their diet was often meager, relying heavily on bread pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew, and whatever else they could grow or forage. Yet, their contribution was immense. Without the labor of these millions of unnamed women, medieval society would have collapsed. They weren't just helping out. They were co-producers, their work in the fields, gardens, and homes underpinning the entire agricultural system. They fed their families, they contributed to the Lord's wealth, and they ensured the cycle of planting and harvesting continued year after weary year. Their lives were tough, but they were the true, unsung foundation of the medieval world.